Prynhawn da a chroeso cynnes I bob un ohonoch sydd yn ymuno ar sesiwn heddiw. Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to all of you joining the session today. Mae'r digwyddiad yn rhan o gyfres gynadleddau rhithwyr MIT ar ein cyfer ni yng Nghymru. This event is part of the Wales MIT Virtual Conference Series. I'm Alwen Williams. I'm the Portfolio Director for the North Wales Economic Ambition Board, and I have the pleasure of introducing the event and our speaker today, Dr. Nelson Reppening. As many of you will know, MIT is one of the world's top research and academic institutions with globally renowned expertise in areas such as technology, engineering, sciences, and leadership. It also boasts 93 Nobel laureates amongst many other accolades. Research has shown that MIT alumni have launched over 30,000 companies around the world, employing over 4 million people and generating almost $2 trillion in annual revenues. As you might expect, many global businesses seek to partner with MIT, including familiar names like Google, Shell, Intel, Samsung, and Siemens. But businesses here in Wales are also able to engage directly with MIT through the Welsh Government's membership of the Industrial Liaison Programme, which has made today's session possible. This includes access to the latest online resources and research, webinars and bespoke meetings with MIT faculty on specific areas of interest. Before taking on my current role in North Wales, I spent 24 years working for BT and Openreach. And during my time as director of BT in Wales, I was lucky to be invited to attend MIT at Boston. This was part of a Welsh Government Industry Liaison Programme, and a small cohort of businesses and business representatives from across sectors in Wales. We attended the Innovations in Management Conference in September 2017. I can honestly say it was a fantastic opportunity to be totally immersed in the MIT world, and really great to hear world-leading insights on some of the biggest and most complex challenges the world is facing. Having a background in the telecoms and technology, I thought I was going into the trip with my eyes fully open, but I can honestly say that I had some great moments of clarity on both a personal and a professional level whilst I was there. I suppose one of my biggest personal learnings, having reflected on everything I saw and heard during my time at Boston, is that the power of collaborative problem solving, inquiry, research, innovation, experimentation is really helping us to unravel big and complex issues together, and that the value of being a strong and resilient leader, giving the authority to lead, and or taking the opportunity and the empowerment to lead are all important components of a solution and this ecosystem that we have in a working world. I also learned that having all of these elements or behaviors coexisting within an organization at multiple different levels makes for a much better cohesive working environment. Crises such as COVID-19 tend to bring out the best and the worst of organizations. Our guest speaker today, Dr. Nelson Reppening, will explore management processes and the importance of being innovative in order to lead our organizations through such challenging times. Nelson is the Associate Dean of Leadership and Special Projects, the Faculty Director of the MIT Leadership Center, and the School of Management Distinguished Professor of System Dynamics and Organization Studies at the MIT Sloan School of Management. His early work focused on understanding the difficulties organizations faced in embedding well-established tools and practices, and he has worked with many such organizations to develop new capabilities in both manufacturing and new product development. Nelson now focuses on two key areas: developing the theory and practice of dynamic work design, a new approach to designing work that's both effective and engaging, and also dynamic management systems, a method for ensuring that day-to-day work is tightly linked to the strategic objectives of the firm. His research has been recognised with several awards along the way, and we're delighted that Nelson is able to share some of his insights with us today. As I hand over to Nelson, can I please encourage you all to post any questions using the questions and answer function, and we'll be addressing as many as possible at the end of the session. Without further ado, Nelson, over to you.
Owen, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, morning where I am. And I'm looking forward to spending the next few minutes with you and talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done at MIT. I'm sure you all would agree with me that it's been a bit of an odd year. I certainly didn't imagine a year ago at this time that I would be doing the majority of my teaching from my living room. And, that probably pales in comparison to the changes that you've all had to make and, a lot of aspects of your organizations. I'm an organization theorist by training and trade. That's the thing I work on. And so for me and my field, crises like this pose an interesting yet very challenging way of looking at organizations, if you want to go with the metaphor, kind of a new window into our basic operations. And what I want to talk about just a little bit today is both what that window reveals in terms of how you meet any type of crisis. Obviously, COVID is a pretty serious one, but organizations have hiccups all the time. But more generally, how your organization behaves in a crisis is often a good window and a diagnostic into many of the aspects that you face day to day, even in non-crisis times. And from that, I want to build on that a little framework that I think you might find useful to think about how you can make your organization a little bit more effective and probably a little bit more agile. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to manage in a crisis and a few tips for doing it better. And as I said, kind of the central thesis of my remarks today is really going to be that crises very much tend to bring out the best and worst of your organization's culture. So it gives you a new window or a lens into how your organization operates and a way of seeing things that would normally be obscured in, sort of non-crisis times. And the trick is at a high level that those things that you really like that you see during crisis times are things that you want to figure out how to keep doing once we get back to normal operations. And then it probably also reveals a few things that are a little bit less savory, and we want to make sure that we try to eliminate or at least diminish those. So that's the overall goal. And what I thought I would do to give you a sense of this idea that a crisis gives you a new lens into how your organization operates is I want to share with you an example that a recent former student shared with me about what was happening in her organization. I've disguised all the names here to protect both guilty and innocent, but as I go through this, see if this looks familiar and you see any elements of your own organization in this little story. So the student in question, again, changed name. Her name is Jane. She works for a professional service firm that does consulting and training. And she happens to be a junior member of their senior leadership team. And just like my industry and, uncountable others, in the early days of the pandemic last spring, they had to very rapidly adapt to a remote delivery model. So they were used to delivering consulting and training on site. And suddenly, they have to move to doing it from their living rooms and kitchens, just like everybody else. Okay? Very critically for this story, Jane's a junior member of the senior leadership team. This is a sort of mid-sized consultancy. And the leadership team meets virtually about every 2 weeks on Zoom, just like everybody else. Okay? Now, probably very similar to what you all experience, in the course of this rapid adaptation, Jane identified a new technology opportunity that required a relatively modest financial investment to exercise, but was not present in her annual budget. Right. And so just like most of us, we did our budgets for 2020, in the summer and fall of 2019. And certainly I did not have global pandemic in, my set of things that I requested money for. And so she needed an out of cycle budget request. Now, if this technology were to turn out to have worked, the first opportunity to use it with a client was about 6 weeks away. And if it proved to be effective, there would be ongoing opportunities about a month apart to continue to use this. Right. And you can imagine, I won't go into details, but there's lots of little things that as we move to remote delivery, it's nice to have some technology to support you. Okay? Now, it turns out that this technology was identified just after one of those meetings that happened every 2 weeks. So what did she do? She did what I think we all would do, which is she sent an email to her leadership team colleagues and asked them if she should have the money. Okay? Now, she very nicely provided me with the email chain that followed this. So I want to go through it in some detail because I think it's quite revealing of how organizations often operate. So Monday at noon, she sent an email to her colleagues and she requested the budget authorization, relatively modest for the size of this company. And here's what happens next. So 24 hours later at about noon on Tuesday, the Human Resources Vice President responded by saying there was no existing process for out-of-cycle requests and expressed worry that if they gave Jane the money, this would set a precedent and everybody else in the organization would very rapidly be asking for extra money for things that weren't in their budgets as well. She also raised a separate issue in the email about perceived inequities in the budget allocation process that were basically unrelated to Jane's request. Okay? Almost immediately, the finance VP chimed in, and he suggested that the process did exist for out-of-cycle approvals. However, the process probably wasn't appropriate for the new world of COVID and that maybe the leadership team should get together and talk about it. Okay? The technology lead chimed in soon after. All this email sort of exchange happened in the space of an hour, confirmed there was an existing process for out-of-cycle requests, provided a bit of history of how the prior HR manager had created it, further hints that perhaps Jane's proposed investment might be redundant with prior work in his function, but he wasn't sure. And then the CEO chimed in saying that she had no particular view on the particular investment, but was worried about the risk of precedent, that might have to be walked back. Again, they were worried that everybody in the organization would suddenly be asking for more money as they tried to adapt to COVID. Okay. Turns out the business development manager was sort of underwater with the client. And even though his business would probably be most impacted by Jane's proposal, didn't have time to reply. Okay. So if you're keeping track at home, we are now at Tuesday night. Jane still doesn't have an answer to her question. So what does she do? Well, again, I think she does what we would do, which is seeing that her request had made it through the leadership team and a bunch of issues had been raised, but she doesn't have a clear decision. She writes another note summarizing the issues and asks her colleagues if she can have a yes/no decision. Okay? Later that evening, the HR manager chimes in again, thanks everybody for their insights, and suggests that she and Jane schedule a face-to-face meeting to discuss the specific details of the proposal and try to work through all the issues that were raised in the email thread. In the meantime, with a little bit of embarrassment, Jane realized that in the haste of her initial email on Monday, she'd forgotten several pieces of context that were critical to her pitch. She emails the HR manager with the details. Jane and the HR manager schedule a Zoom meeting, which takes place on Friday afternoon, about 5 days after Jane's email request, and he approves Jane's request, and off she goes. Okay. So again, for those of you keeping score at home, here's the rough box score. It took about 96 hours, so 4 days from initial request to decision. The request generated 12 emails. And again, she nicely provided me with the full chain. I've just showed you a subset. Let's assume that each of those emails took 15 minutes to write, which I think is probably generous. And let's also assume that each of those emails was actually value added relative to the topic at hand. And the Friday meeting she had with the HR manager took about 30 minutes. So you put all those together. There was about 3.5 hours of knowledge work required to make that decision. Again, generously assuming that each of those emails contributed to the decision. And so that means that over 95% of the time between when Jane sent her email and when she got her decision was total waste. It was just time that we were waiting for meetings to be scheduled or emails to be answered or whatever it might be. And so as a consequence, in the fast-paced changing world of adapting to a global pandemic, Jane now has 5 weeks to develop her technology instead of 6, right? And that actually could make the difference in terms of their ability to exercise it and generate it with the next technology. Right? So my first question for you all is, does this sound familiar? And I have run this exercise enough recently that I'm betting the answer to this question as yes. And the typical response I get when I ask people to type in the chat is, oh, that doesn't look so bad. It's way worse in my organization. And I think that's pretty typical. I was doing a little email this morning before I got started. I would be embarrassed to admit that the number of unanswered emails I have in my inbox, I might be on the lower end of the distribution, but I think that's pretty typical, right? We spend lots of time trading emails back and forth, trying to get things done. But what I'm going to try to argue is that this turns out to be a wildly inefficient way of getting things done in any circumstances. But having emails being traded back and forth is particularly problematic when you need to adapt quickly, as we all probably had to do with the advent of COVID. And hopefully we won't have another global pandemic, but certainly your organization is going to have other crises that require nimble action. And if you respond to it in a manner similar to this little example I just gave you, that's going to be highly problematic and inefficient. Okay? So as Alwyn nicely said in the introduction, the thing that my research team and I have been working on at MIT is something we call dynamic work design. And the basic idea is this, the sort of insight of this research is that the idea of organization design has been in the scholarly literature for over 100 years at this juncture. But what's kind of popped out of the work that we've done is that most of what scholars like myself have done and most of the frameworks that we teach you all are very much static. And that there's a whole other aspect of your organization design that has been largely hidden from view. So what do we mean by that? Well, it's a simple way of thinking about it. Think of the static design as everything you do before you turn your organization on and actually operate it. So all of you have probably been through multiple major reorganizations in your careers, and you know how this works, right? You sit in the conference room with the leadership team, maybe you hire an expensive consultant to help you, and you sit in front of a whiteboard or flip charts and you scribble, 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 and you decide that you're going to move your organization from function to business, or from business to function, or from one of those to matrix, or front end, back end, or whatever the latest flavor is. But the idea is that you're going to change your configuration from one thing to the other. And typically, the manifestation of that new design, the kind of high-level manifestation, is the organization chart, right? I'm now going to report to a business lead rather than a function lead, or we're going to have this matrix where I have two bosses or whatever it is, okay? All that stuff, of course, is incredibly useful, and I don't mean to diminish the static part of the design at all. But as you all know, no matter how much time you spend in that conference room, and no matter how much money you pay that consultant, and no matter how detailed that organization chart might be, the day you turn that new organization on, not everything goes as planned, right? That there's going to be problems, right? I don't know how to communicate with the new person I report to, or the IT system that I've always used my whole career doesn't connect well with this new function that I need to interact with, or whatever it might be, right? The dynamic part of your design, the element that has been somewhat obscured in the kind of conventional approach to this, is how does your organization respond to those problems? And the case that I'm going to make here is that the way an organization responds to problems, and Alwyn nicely alluded to this earlier, is in my view a watershed moment. And what I mean by that is that in some organizations, you can respond to those problems as an opportunity to learn and develop, in which case it's very likely that the trajectory of your organization is going to be extremely positive. But what happens in lots of other organizations is that problem gets kind of swept under the rug, or we fix it with duct tape and safety pins, or whatever it might be. And that actually has the tendency to sort of harden the organization's arteries rather than make it better. So what dynamic work design really is just a set of principles to think about. Once we turn that new design on, right, and things don't go quite as planned, because they never go quite as planned, how do we respond? And it turns out that there are some ways that are more effective to responding than others. Okay? Now, dynamic work design has 4 basic principles. I'm not going to have time to go through all of those, but the one I want to dig into today is what we call the second principle here, which is connect the human chain through triggers and checks. And if you're interested in the other 3, this is an academic's favorite thing to say. I have papers on this, and we'd be happy to supply you with some of the things that we've written about this. But what I want to dig into is the second principle, which is connect the human chain through triggers and checks. And the basic idea behind that principle is what we're going to talk about is when an organization needs to communicate, just like Jane did to her colleagues, what is the design they use to make sure that the information gets surfaced and resolved? And it turns out that there's some better and worse ways to do this. Now, this idea about how an organization chooses to communicate with each other actually has a long history in organization theory. And if you were to take an organization design class from me or any of my colleagues really at any business school, one of the things that we would teach you on the first day is something that's known as contingency theory. And contingency theory is a really simple idea. And the idea is that you should design the work to match the frequency of communication required to do that work. And contingency theory typically talks about two kind of extreme designs. Okay? So one extreme, you could imagine a factory, right? The communication requirements in a modern factory are relatively low, right? I do my part exactly the same way every time, and then I hand my partially completed widget to the person who's downstream from me, and we don't really have to talk a lot because I do my work exactly the same way every time. They know what they're getting, right? And you have lots of this in your organization, even if you don't manufacturing, right? You know, when I come back from a trip, back when we used to travel, and I finish up my expense report, right, I can hand it to the next person in the chain. We don't really have to talk about it a lot because there's a standard form and it's done the same way every time. Okay? On the flip side, some work requires lots of communication, right? And that was traditionally known as an organic design. So if you're designing a new product or we're treating a complicated patient case or we're dealing with a really unhappy customer, right, that work cannot be pre-specified, right? It doesn't have clear handoffs. And so therefore, we probably need a lot of communication. And so the organization design that we would use there is because we can't really pre-specify all the work, we're basically just going to put people in a room together, give them a lot of caffeine and chocolate, and allow them to communicate as they need, right? So on the one hand, we have the mechanistic design where we design the work serially with relatively low communication requirements. On the other extreme, we have what we now call kind of the studio design, which is we basically put people in the room and we let them communicate as they need. Okay? Now, you can make a nice picture out of this because you know, everything in business schools is a 2x2 matrix. So across the bottom axis there, we have the type of work. Is it highly precise, like the same factory work we do day in and day out? Or is it very ambiguous, like treating a patient or developing a new product? And then we have two basic ways of organizing it. We can put them serially, like a assembly line in a factory, or we can do it collaboratively. And then your job as the would-be work designer is basically just to pick the box. So if the work is highly precise, we're going to design it as a kind of factory design. And keep in mind that this can also be knowledge work, right? You have lots of routine knowledge work processes in your organizations, expense reports and invoicing and so on and so forth, that even though the thing that's moving is information, it's not particularly ambiguous. And so we just hand it off from one person to the next. Okay? And then on the flip side, when the work is highly ambiguous, developing a new product, whatever it might be, we're going to use what we now call a studio design, which is we're again, put everybody in a room and let them collaborate. So for 70 plus years, what we all taught you is that your job as the would-be work designer is to pick the box, right? Which is to figure out the kind of work you have. Is it precise or ambiguous? And then you design it either as factory work or as a studio work, right? Now, that's been very successful, but a few years ago, I had an experience that revealed to me, and hence part of the elements of dynamic work design, that this is a pretty static way of thinking about it, right? We're imagining here that all work that you do is either routine or non-routine and fits pretty squarely in one of these two boxes, but of course the world's a little bit more complicated than that. So here's the experience that kind of opened my eyes to this. A couple years ago, a colleague and I were in Japan and we were taking a tour of a bunch of Toyota suppliers. And I happen to be a factory nerd, so there's nothing I like better than crawling around factories, so time of my life. And we watched a little episode that has been written about zillions of times in the mythology of Toyota, but watching it in action opened my eyes in a way that had not happened before. And one of the factories we visited was making trunk latches. So if any of you happen to own a Toyota vehicle, the trunk latch probably came from this factory. And I spent some time watching the main assembly operation. And it was really a well-designed piece of work. An operator was taking a housing, was grabbing multiple parts, was populating the parts on the housing, then a spring went in, then the other piece of the housing went on and a bolt went through, and then it got handed off to the next operation. So, I mean, it would have taken years to design this as well as it was. Every part was in exactly the right place. She knew every hand motion. It was like a ballet in a factory. Very, very impressive, right? It's as good as an example of a factory design as you're probably ever going to see. But while I'm watching, something goes wrong, and she can't get the work done in the time allotted. Okay? Now, you all know the mythology of Toyota, right? When an operator can't get their work done in the time allotted, what are they supposed to do? Well, of course, what they're supposed to do, and in fact, Toyota features this in their advertising, is you're supposed to stop the line, right? And Toyota has the famous andon cord where you reach up and pull the line and it stops. Okay? Now, in this factory, it turned out to be a big yellow button rather than a cord, but the same thing happened. She pushed the button, Supervisor came running over. They had about a 5-minute conversation. It turns out that the material handler had dropped off one of the boxes of parts and put it down with the wrong orientation. So they just rotate the box, problem solved. She goes back to work, and the supervisor runs off to find the material handler to remind him or her, make sure you put the box down in the right place. Okay? And again, this little story has been sort of written about endlessly in the mythology of Toyota, right? But what I realized in that little moment, and then of course on the very long flight on the way home, is that this contingency theory in the 2 boxes I had been teaching wrong. And what I had been telling you, or what I would have told you, is that what made Toyota Toyota is that they were better at designing this than anybody else. Okay? And how did they get there? Right? What I now believe to be the case, and we have lots of examples of using this successfully, is that what Toyota actually does in order to build such good factories is they have a much more dynamic setting that allows them to move back and forth between these 2 modes as needed, right? That andon cord, or the big yellow button, is now what we call a trigger, right? And all a trigger is a rule that says, when has enough ambiguity or uncertainty crept into the process that we now need to change the design, right? Because if you think about what happened, as long as that operator can make those trunk latches in the allotted time correctly, we don't need communication, and we certainly don't need that supervisor looking over his or her shoulder, right? The moment something goes wrong, though, some uncertainty or ambiguity has crept into the work, and now we need a different design, right? And by pushing that button, what we call a trigger, what they've done is they've temporarily moved the design from factory to studio. The supervisor comes over, they have a conversation, they solve the problem, right? And so what I now believe makes Toyota Toyota, and the reason that they are so good at designing factories, is they have created a very clever system that allows them to move back and forth between factory work and studio work on an as-needed basis, right? Does that supervisor need to look at the previous 100 trunk latches? No, right? They were done correctly, right? It would just be disruptive. The moment something goes wrong and there's a problem to be solved, now we need a very rapid escalation from factory work to studio to solve the problem and move forward. And once you see it this way, and this is really the kind of main message of the talk, is that once you see that all work cycles between kind of individual routine work and collaborative work, your job as the would-be work designer changes quite fundamentally, because what I would have told you before is that your job is to pick the box, right? But now your job in a more dynamic world is to pick the rules that determine when work goes from individual work to studio work and back again. And that by designing those rules, you can often make your organization work lots better, okay? Now, let's go back to Jane, right? What happens when she doesn't have a clear rule, right? Remember, right, the leadership team met every 2 weeks, right? So they were going from individual work to studio work on a every 2-week frequency, right? And there was no formal mechanism. She didn't have the equivalent of the yellow button to push that says, hey, I need help. I need some more money. So when she doesn't have that yellow button, or the meeting frequency is not enough, what does she do? Well, she does what we would all do, which is she sends an email, right? But it turns out that when we're dealing with ambiguity, right, when we have a problem to be solved, when we have uncertainty, electronically mediated communication tends to be an extremely inefficient way to process that kind of information, right? And you all know this intuitively, because I'm sure you've all had the experience of a text message exchange that has gone horribly off the rails because of some basic misunderstanding. When we try to process ambiguity or solve problems via email, what do we get? We got exactly what we saw in the example I opened with, which is we get tons of iteration. And there's lots of research in the communications field that says when we have a problem to be solved or ambiguity to be resolved, the fastest way to do it is to have a face-to-face conversation. And the moment that we put electronics in between us, the inefficiency goes up. So what happens is we get what we call ineffective iteration, right? And this is exactly what happened with Jane, right? There was a problem to be solved that was out of cycle. And by trying to do it via email rather than a face-to-face meeting, the thing that they ended up with was this kind of endless iteration with emails going back and forth, and it was far less efficient, right? And the solution, of course, which was probably pretty obvious from the example, is in a crisis moment, right, that leadership team probably needs to meet more than every 2 weeks because there's lots of ambiguity and uncertainty that's creeping into the process. And so certainly every week, but maybe even every day is required. And so what they need to do is they need to cycle between this kind of work and this kind of work much more rapidly to meet the needs of the organization. And if they don't, the side effect of that is going to be both inefficiency and, like we've all experienced, email inboxes that are overflowing with messages as we try to get them done. Okay, so I'm going to skip my example here, but let me finish with some advice, and I'd be happy to take a few questions. Second thing is, I said, first off, there's a paper about this, which again we're happy to make available. But in terms of how to sort of take advantage of this insight, I have sort of three things to finish with here, which is number one, the most important piece of advice that I can give you is match the frequency of meetings to the speed with which your world is changing, right? And particularly in crisis times, the error that we see most often is organizations do not meet often enough. Now, I'm imagining you're all thinking like, geez, I go to meetings all the time. How can you be telling me I need to meet more often? Well, the problem is you're probably not using the meetings you go to for what they're good for, right? One of the other things that's popped out of this research is that face-to-face communication is probably one of the most valuable assets you have in your organization, right? So if I have a meeting with 9 of you for an hour, right, that's 10 hours of work that's not getting done for your organization, right? So we want to make sure that that 10 hours is dedicated to what it's good for. Well, what meetings are good for is resolving ambiguity and uncertainty. Now, that sounds kind of academic, so let me give you a more practical framing. What meetings are good for is solving problems and making decisions. Okay? If you're not doing one of those two things in a meeting, then you really need to ask yourself, is this meeting worth having, right? So if you think about the Toyota scheme, right, this is about as spare a setup as you can come up with. That operator is making trunk latches until something goes wrong. Now we have a meeting, supervisor runs over, we solve the problem, back to work, right? So chances are you're having lots of meetings right now, but you're not using them to resolve the fundamental issues that face your organization. And so in order to take advantage of this insight, you probably need to meet more frequently because meetings need to match the speed with which the world is changing, but you also need to make sure that you're using those meetings productively. So the second thing that we recommend is to use, particularly for online meetings, some kind of online visual repository to capture all the issues that need to be resolved. There's lots of ones out there, Trello, IOBEA, you probably all have kind of your favorite online thing. I don't have a particular view of that, but all the decisions that need to be made or problem needs to be solved, make sure those go on a list, start each meeting by prioritizing the issues that that particular group is best positioned to resolve. And then finally, as I said earlier, you want to measure the productivity of meetings by the volume of decisions you make and the problems you solve, right? So if you think about what happened in my opening example, right? Jane had a problem that needed to be solved. She needed money for something. She couldn't get an answer, right? That could have been resolved in 30 seconds had they had, a daily meeting or a meeting every couple of days, but instead it created all this additional sort of iteration. If you find yourself keeping track of meeting productivity by decisions and problem-solving efforts, you will find lots of meetings you have that are very unproductive, and you'll also find ones that you should be having that you probably are not having right now. And if you can figure out how to match that meeting frequency first to make the meetings effective and then match it to the speed with which your world is changing, at least in our experiences, you can get some pretty significant gains in the effectiveness of your organization. Okay? All right, let me stop there. I'm happy to take a few questions, and I really appreciate you all taking the time to listen to me this morning.
We've got a shy crowd today, not many questions coming in, but can I kick us off to get your insights on a couple of things, actually. How you feel COVID and the pandemic globally has changed behaviors in terms of utilizing time effectively. Certainly if I reflect on my own experience, I feel that in this COVID era, it's easier to access decision makers because everybody's at home. So there's that sort of question has been going through my mind as well. And also in terms of removing failure, so the example you gave with Toyota stopping the line, how do you see the future of that evolving with more and more robotics bringing accuracy into sort of factory production lines? And the example you gave there was a sort of a manual mistake effectively somewhere earlier in the line. So just a couple of things there from me.
Yeah, great question. So I would say on the first one, in terms of efficiency, I mean, my experience has been very mixed. I think, one thing I've noticed is that um, both in my own organization, but also talking to students and so on and so forth is, there were lots of little decisions and pieces of information that get shared when we were in the office together that now each of those requires a Zoom meeting, right? So if I needed to ask my boss, the dean, what date is this or what are we doing with this particular class? I could wait and I'd run into him in the hallway or whatever, right? And now that's a 15 minutes or half hour Zoom meeting. And so I think that part has caused efficiency to go down. And one of the things that I've been working on with my teams a lot is, let's not have an individual Zoom meeting for every issue. Let's meet more frequently, but make sure you do a good job of backlogging the things that you want to know. So one way that I've taken advantage of this insight, even pre-COVID, I've used it more, is I tell all the teams that report through me, I will meet with you as frequently as you want, in some cases every day. The only thing that I request of you is please don't send me an email unless it's an emergency, right? And so that means, if we have a daily meeting, we go through the list, we can get it done much more efficiently than trying to keep track of 12 emails a day of, what might be relatively small questions, but questions that need to be answered, because that face-to-face communication is just a much more efficient way to deal with that. And I actually think, and this was kind of the gist of this talk, COVID has really given us all an opportunity to revisit some of those work patterns that we had that were just kind of so embedded in our organizations that we didn't really even think about anymore. A lot of people, when I ask them, well, how come you have your staff meeting weekly? They kind of look at me like I'm nuts. Like, well, because we've always had it every week. And I think, sometimes a weekly cadence is good, but sometimes you need to meet more or less. And so, this is a great opportunity to revisit some of those basics. In terms of automation, if you go back and read some of the original writings of Taiichi Ohno, who was one of the fathers of the Toyota system, he has this phrase, which I wish had gotten more popular, called autonomation, which he describes as automation with the human touch. And basically the gist, and actually I saw Elon Musk say something about this recently, which was kind of a funny full circle thing, is basically the gist of it is that you should let computers and automation do what they're good for, which is they're great at repetitive tasks, right? What they're not so good at is solving problems. And so the kind of essence of the Toyota scheme is, if you think of my lower box in that diagram I showed you before, at some point, most of what happens in that lower box may be done by robots and automation and so on and so forth. The trick is to design the system so that when something goes wrong, it's immediately escalated. And then, our great problem-solving brains can come to bear in terms of dealing with that. So that may mean we have a lot fewer people in the factory, and those that are there are, technicians and problem solvers and higher skilled workers. But I think the same principle really applies, and it's going to be a long time until, I think automation has the kind of same diagnostic capability that a well-trained operator does. And I think, in some sense, that's a good thing. It means that people will be doing fewer, highly repetitive, boring, sort of more dangerous tasks, and they'll be more engaged in the stuff that human beings are good at. Now, the flip side of that is we may need fewer people to do those jobs, which, creates a whole sort of macroeconomic cycle that's, other people will have to work out. But,
great. Thank you, Nelson. We've got some questions coming in now. So I
super.
might just bundle a couple of them up for you, first of all. There's a question from Glynis asking, given that people feel more isolated, missing that human interaction, the water cooler conversations, the car park conversations in the workplace, what would you describe the well-being aspect of team meetings, or would you describe the well-being aspect of team meetings as essential to work, even if few decisions or other problems are being directly addressed by the meeting? So that's one.
Yep.
And then another question from Al Wilson. Meetings are good for making decisions. How do we control virtual situations where we're looking for ideas and concepts, collect ideas in advance, and then decide on which ones you follow? And that's a question.
Yeah, so great one. So on the first one, I think, it's a great point. All the science says is that human beings are very social animals, and we've definitely lost it. We don't have those informal interactions, how is the spouse and the kids and what you do this weekend and so on and so forth. And I have been talking to, students and alums, and I think I've noticed that people have come up with some really clever things to do to keep their teams connected, and it may be as simple as, let's reserve 5 or 10 minutes from before and we'll share things that we did over the weekend, or someone was telling me recently that he and his team, each week they have a half-hour virtual beer tasting on Friday afternoon where someone picks the beer, then they all try or whatever. So I do think it requires more deliberate attention and design than you need it otherwise, because it just doesn't happen naturally, or have lunch every week or whatever it might be. I think the trick to that is to make sure that when you're having social time, you're having social time. And then when you have sort of meeting time, you have meeting time. And, I hate to be sort of so deliberate, but, if it's 15 minutes and 45 or half and half or whatever, I don't care. But I think you do need to kind of bound it, because I think if you don't, what you find is that meetings can become a little bit sort of unfocused, and they sort of wander back and forth between social time and then, solving problems. So I think it does require deliberate design, and you need to kind of try to keep those two things separately. And then in terms of what the second question, which I think came from Al, I would say two things, which is the innovation literature is really clear that the best way to kind of bubble up ideas is to have people do brainstorming individually first, put all the ideas together, and then as a group, kind of cluster and rank order them. And so, having people brainstorm a list of things before the meeting is actually a great practice, even in non-virtual times, because it tends to produce a better diversity of outcomes. And then the other thing is, I think, meetings are finite. You're never going to have time for every issue in the organization. So prioritization is really clear. I highly recommend that prioritization be done either before the meeting or in advance. But I think Al raises a good question of who's the right person to do it. I think ultimately, that tends to devolve to the sort of most senior person in the room that kind of has authority for that. But, that's just kind of my preference. I think, you just need a process for it, right? It could be team voting. It could be the boss decides. It could be the executive committee decides. I don't really have a strong view of that. I think that will be mostly tuned to your organization. But what's really important is that when I walk into the meeting, those are the three things that we got to get done today, and that we actually get those done. Because I think there's another problem, and this goes to the fourth dynamic work design principle, is organizations from top to bottom have a really strong tendency to bite off more than they can chew. And as a consequence, they spread their resources much too thinly, and then actually nothing gets done, right? So if we try to tackle 10 things instead of 3, we race through them, and then you get back into the setting of the example that I started with, which is that we didn't really resolve any of them. So then now we've got thousands of emails in between the meeting to get it resolved. And that's just a super inefficient way to resolve ambiguity in your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you okay for another?
Yeah, sure. I can take one or two more.
Okay, great. So we've got a question from Adam here, and it's relating to our time. And given most of us are time poor, can your model be adapted to recognize availability as a limiting factor? And Adam sort of recognizes how hard it is sometimes to get the right people in the same space at the same time in order to make those decisions.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and I have become, so this is a research topic that I will dig into and what remains in my career, but there are many times in which actually taking flexibility out of a system opens up possibilities, which always seems a little bit counterintuitive to me. And I think this is one of them, which is I have become a big fan of the first big decision is to get that meeting cadence correct, right? And as I said, the advice I would give you is match the speed with which or the cadence of when you're meeting to the speed with which your world is changing. I've helped organizations in a couple like major crisis situations like industrial accidents or stuff like that. And there are times for the first couple of days when you might actually have to meet every hour, right? The world is changing fast enough that we have new information that has to be shared every hour, right? Any of you that may be familiar with agile software development, they've had, tremendous success with that daily stand-up meeting. And so again, I think the trick to solving Adam's problem is if you can get the cadence correctly matched, which is it's a daily meeting, it's weekly, hourly, or whatever it is, once it becomes a standing venue and it's efficient, then I think with time, people will start to adjust their schedules because they realize that, boy, that half-hour meeting in the morning is so useful and productive. I'm going to, make sure that I'm there each time. And again, that's what I've had incredibly good luck with my teams, which is to say, I'll meet on essentially any frequency that you want. but do your best to keep stuff off email unless it's an emergency. And so what that means is we have our hour of interaction every day, and then everyone can go back to work and actually get work done, right? Rather than answering Slack messages. And the other thing that's happening is that, as electronically mediated communication proliferates, we have more ways to interrupt each other more effectively than we ever have before, right? And there's this kind of escalation hierarchy, right? If I send you an email and you don't answer, then I'm going to send you a Slack message. And if you don't answer that, then I'm going to text you. And if that doesn't work, I'll call you. And then, right, so that has made this problem much worse in some sense, because we've got lots of ways of interrupting each other, which is not always super effective.
Absolutely. And I completely relate with that. You kind of lean on every single channel you can
Right.
to get a response, and it can become overbearing and difficult to navigate, actually. So thank you.
Well, and actually, let me say one more thing, which is
Yeah.
if you find yourself doing that, or it's being done to you, that is a almost perfect sign that you're not meeting frequently enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if, let's imagine you and I had a daily meeting, right, I'd be tempted to Slack you, but if I know I'm going to see you tomorrow morning at the stand-up, okay, I can just write it down, and I know I'm less than 24 hours away from an answer. And that's the reason I start with that open example. If you and I only meet every week, well, I can't wait a week to get the answer. So now we start with the interruption, stuff like that. So if you have that problem, which is very common, consider at least running an experiment with the higher cadence sort of check-in, and then a rule that, we're not going to interrupt each other unless it's really an emergency that, has to be resolved faster than on the 24-hour or whatever the cadence is.
Yeah, that's a great tip. I think something we can all reflect on and apply to our own practices. I'm very conscious of your time, Nelson. Thank you. And we have come to the end of the session, but I will say we've got some great questions that have come in. And maybe I would like to sort of offer that we may be able to follow up with you on those questions outside of the session, because they are really great questions about sort of self-awareness in management and leadership. And what we've heard today, I think, is making people reflect on practices and processes. So thank you very, very much.
My pleasure.
To those of you who have asked for a copy of Nelson's paper, you will be able to access the papers. We will be sharing an email address on the next couple of slides, which will tell you how to contact the Welsh Government, who can then follow up and share a copy of the paper with you. I think in sort of summing up, I think the last 40 minutes or so has given as many points to reflect on, which I think we can apply in a broader sort of organizational sense to the work that we're doing, the decisions that we're making, and the collaborations that we're having. Certainly for me, it's about really scrutinizing and interrogating how effective my agendas will be for calling meetings and articulating the outcomes and the decisions being made, but also giving my time in a harsher way. So being really clear with organizers of sessions that inputs and outputs need to be clear in order for that meeting or that convening to be effective, and removing waste effectively from our limited resources, which is time currently. Just to bring the sessions to a close, I'll give you I'm delighted to thank Nelson in the first instance. Thank you, Nelson. It's been an extremely insightful session, and it's been great having you talk to us here in Wales.